We know where the middleware is now. Business web v1 mid, and you see a transaction, go, business, sorry, web v1 mid, transaction.go. Okay. So we start off with this piece of middleware called execute in transaction. And this is where we hide the call to begin, the call to commit, and if an error has occurred, the call to rollback. Now, you can always call rollback after commit because this code checks to see if the code actually did finish the transaction. My problem, though, is I needed logging to know whether or not we rolled back because we didn't commit or anything. So I added a little field called has committed. And if we call commit, I set it to true, literally so I could just log this here. And my eyes can see whether or not we rolled back because of failure or not. You could say, well, Bill, you could analyze things because you would, I don't want to do that. I either want to see begin commit or begin commit or begin rollback. I don't want to have to like fight my brain when looking at the logs. So that's why I did that. So you see the middleware, right? Now here's the problem. Here's one of the problems. When you begin a transaction, and right now we're missing a package here to do this, but when you begin a transaction, you get back a transaction that's going to represent what we have to execute every query against now. So we can't just pull a random connection out of the DB anymore. Everything has to be executed against this TX. Everything. So one of the things you're going to see here, we're going to add this transaction package in a second. What are we doing here? We're storing that transaction that we just got back from the begin into the context. And my guess is we're doing that because we're going to have to do something else in the handler function to make sure that we tell the storage layer to use this TX, not anything else. That's going to be our responsibility. Okay, so I want to do two things here. I want to bring in this transaction package, and to me it makes sense that it's in the data layer. Oh, we already have a transaction package, don't we? Oh, I'm in the wrong project, sorry. I was going to say, that is weird. Okay, try it again. Transaction.go. I'm just going to bring the whole thing in so we can look at it. So what do we see at the top of the transaction package? We see an interface we defined called a transaction that has two acts of behavior, commit and rollback. And then we have another interface that we call the beginner interface, which has one act of behavior, begin, which returns a concrete value, which is a transaction. Okay, so we've got these two interfaces. Let's continue. We also have a basic API that lets us store this transaction or a transaction in the context, or we get it back out. Okay, fine. And then we have this function here called execute under transaction, which I believe is only used as a helper function for tests. So we use this only for testing. It's the middleware function we're going to use for the application processing. I could actually get rid of it and should be fine. So these are the two things here that I've got. These two interfaces and the ability to store whatever this transaction is in the context. Okay. I'm going to reload the window because it wasn't accepting this package. Okay. I want you to look at the function signature for the middleware. It accepts a logger and accepts some concrete value that implements the beginner interface. It implements something that knows how to begin. And what does begin do? It returns something that knows how to transact. So we have some concrete type that knows how to begin, that returns something that knows how to commit and roll back. That's why you could see BGN begin, that's our beginner. We get back our transaction. We can roll back and commit against that through the interface. We can also store it. Okay, so we've got our middleware piece in. We've got these interfaces that we need. We've got the context support that we need. What's next? Let's continue on the app layer side of this. All right. Now, I think I have a package called Tran Group, so we can provide an example of how to use transactions. So what I'm going to do is steal some of this code for what we're doing with the user, okay? And even though we don't need it in that user create, I'm just going to put it in there so we can kind of see it. Maybe I'll write another, let's do this. App, service, v1, handlers, group. That's our create, right? How about I do this? We don't need an extra transaction on this because it's already just one thing, but this will just give us the model for it. Okay. One of the first things I want you to see is that I have a function here, or a method, an unexported method called execute under transaction. What this does is constructs a new handlers value with the core APIs using the store transaction that was created via middleware. Interesting. So I'm going to do this. Our handlers is what? It's user and auth. So look at what this function does. This is the beauty of in some cases, I would say, value semantics, but look at what we're doing here. You know, this is an API, so we're using pointer semantics here, but look at what we're doing. When this gets called for some given context, it checks the context to see if there's a transaction in there. There would be a transaction in there if that middleware was injected into the call stream. So if that middleware that we just looked at got executed, we know that there's a transaction in there. We're going to call this function, which we haven't added yet to the business value, called execute under transaction. What it's going to do is construct a brand new user core API that doesn't use the DB anymore, but uses this TX. And then this is the core business packet or core business instance of the API that the rest of the system uses for that request. I'll draw this on the board in a second. Let's add this function to our core business package. I'll draw this on the board in a second. What did I just notice again? Why is there such inconsistency in everything that I do? We had store and then log here. I'm going to fix this anyway. Check everything else later. What this is going to do is construct a brand new core API from the existing information we have, but using this new transaction in place of the DB. We have to do with it again, though, at the store level. We need a different store. A store that now uses this transaction instead of the DB. When the request comes in, it's going to go through that middleware function. That middleware function is going to start a begin, and it's going to store that TX into the context. Then what's going to happen, then we're going to be in this handler function. Here's the handler function. Remember, the handler function is a method. It's a method where the object that is holding it already has a user core, right? It's a method that already has a user core that works with the DB. So if we're going to make any API calls, we're going to make it off of that user core, whatever, query, create, whatever it is. And it works off of the standard DB. But the very first thing we do in the handler is what? We're going to say execute under transaction, which immediately checks to see if we're in the middle of a transaction because of the middleware, which we will be. And then it starts to replace things. So it says, oh, okay, let's do the following while I'm in this handler. Let's not use this anymore. Let's construct another. This is the user core. Let's construct another user core just for this handler call, for this instance. And instead of using the DB, let's use the transaction instead. But that's not enough because the user core has a store and it has to be changed out to also use the TX. And now we have to make sure that we use now this new user core on all the calls. If this handle is using multiple domains, like product, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to create a new product core where it replaces the DB with this TX. And now what that means is for the rest of the calls that we make to process business rules, we're doing it in the transaction. And then when the handler returns, we have the commit or rollback. So all that handler developer needs to do is this at the beginning. Construct a new H. We do this at the beginning. Construct a new H. Change out the receiver for this new one that now contains the transaction that was started by the middleware. But we have to do this a few places. We've got to construct a new user core for this TX. So we come down here and it says, hey, you got to construct not just that, but when we create a new user core, you got to create a new store core. Okay? We also need that interface in order to pull that off, because everything we do here requires an implementation. So we say, okay, we're going to create a new user core, no problem, but you also have to create a new store. So we come here and we say, fine, we'll create a new store. Now, I'm missing this because, let's go back. Remember when I wanted to keep things simple, where was that? It wasn't here. Remember when I wanted to keep things simple and I didn't use the interface, I used SQL DB for, where did I do that? Where was I that I did that? Let me find it. Because now I've lost my mental model of some of this code. There's a place where we got to use the interface. Also, we're missing this code right here. pgxtran.go. Did I not bring over pgxtran.go? Let's see. Yep. I'm also missing some transactional support here in our PGX package. But I know I'm forgetting one more thing. So in the PGX package, we're going to add support for being able to actually execute this begin, but that's not the part I felt like I was missing. Let's go back here. That's going to be it. Okay. If I go back here, we need to use the interface because I have to swap this out. I have to swap it out. When we first did this together, I used the concrete type DB because that's what we needed. And I said, well, we really have an interface there, but let's just use the concrete type because at some point I'm going to want to replace it. So what we've done here now, what does this code do? It essentially constructs a new store that uses the transaction. That uses the transaction that the middleware created instead of the DB. Replaces this with the TX. What does this function do? It gives us a brand new core that now uses that transaction that was created in the middleware. What does this do? It gets us back that new core so we can create a new handler so then we can execute everything against the core APIs with the new transaction. This code does a big replace. It says instead of using the cores that we have for regular use, construct new cores with new stores with the TX and execute everything there and then back. And that allows us then to have cross-domain because we're using that same TX in all the core APIs that we need. It's pretty cool. It's this idea of replacing what we need on the fly. Okay. And with that, now there's one more piece though. Because if you don't inject the middleware, nothing happens, does it? If you don't inject the middleware, nothing happens. So there's actually one more piece we would need to add to this code to make this work. On the route. Let me come back to our code here, the app layer, v1 handlers user group route. I'm going to add another piece of middleware called execute in transaction. And then what we can do is say add that to, we have that other function, so let's copy this. Say users tran. Now I'm curious, yeah, that's what my brain said. It should be last. We want auth to run first, right? We need auth to run first, then we need authorization, then we need transaction support. So look, what does the application developer need to do? Add the middleware. That gives you, once you add the middleware, that gives you this. Gives you the begin, commit, rollback code behind the scenes. It also creates the transaction. Now that you've added the middleware, when we get into the handler itself, create, which one did I call? I said it was going to be called create with tran. The very first thing we do is call this little function, which essentially constructs a new handlers, and then we can make sure that that transaction that got started here is in a brand new user core, brand new product core. Stores are using the new transaction, and everything executes the same, but it's now executing not against that DB, but against that transaction that gets constructed in the middleware. It's super cool. Yeah.
You have one issue. You need to go back to where you set up the handlers. That route is still using the old create.
You're right, man. You are right. You are right. What did I call that? Create with tran? Nice. Create with tran. Yeah. Create with tran. The big takeaway here on this implementation, now that I see it again, is that replacement, right? We replace it, and we start using the new one on the fly, and we can change the state of that, and then none of the other code has to be touched.